Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Do I have to be here, or can you hear me? Speak loudly. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. We were trying to remember, Noreen and I, and with Ann Pavley last night. When was I here last? We can't remember, but we've been here several times. It's always nice to walk around the campus because I had forgotten how beautiful it was. Thank you very much for having me. So today, I'd like to talk about the burden of non-communicable and infectious diseases in Mexico, and I'm going to put it in the context of aging. Thank you. Okay. So first, I'm going to talk about, in the macro sense, about epidemiological transitions in the context of rapid population aging. Then I'd like to talk about how that has implications, in particular, when you combine mixed infectious and chronic diseases in a stage of the epidemiological transition, and how that has implications itself for aging of the population. And then we're going to provide some evidence at the micro level on the impact of infectious and chronic diseases in a rapid aging country like Mexico. I'm going to focus on self-reported health and mortality and just mention results of work that we're pursuing right now on disability. And then I'm going to focus on data sources that are used to study this kind of issues, but in particular, because it's the data source that we produce, I'm going to give you the updates and news on the Mexican Health and Aging Study. So just quickly, everybody in the room probably knows about OMRAN, the classic paper on epidemiological transitions, and talked about the change in diseases that would happen in a society so that infectious diseases would be diminished or eliminated, and giving rise to non-communicable, or in this talk I'm going to be using the terms non-communicable and chronic diseases interchangeably. Some people don't like it. It's highly technical, the difference. But anyway, we talk about infectious and communicable diseases and non-communicable and chronic diseases. And so the idea is that as societies age, non-communicable diseases would emerge. And in particular, then, more recently, other authors have talked about the importance of how the aging of the population occurred, whether it was mostly because of, and the emergence of non-communicable diseases emerges because of demographic changes, as opposed to economic changes. And that, I'm going to talk about how that dictates different paths. And in particular, then, because of the different paths of the transition, then it has different consequences for population health. And most recently, we find on our very interesting short piece in the Science, in which Bierberg, if anybody knows how to pronounce his last name, talks about the interaction between non-communicable diseases and infectious diseases and how that interaction justifies joint interventions, whereas typically the interventions are separate for non-communicable diseases and infectious diseases. So this is in general, the transition, the way it was typically presented. Oh, that is why. Backwards. Okay. So here's the demographic transition. This is just a representation that mostly Bobadilla and Jameson did way back when they were talking about the global burden of disease. They were talking about the demographic transition and the epidemiological transition and how it would result in basically encompass a health transition. So in the demographic transition, typically because of modernization, urbanization, industrialization, higher income, better education, and better medical technology, would give rise to a decline in infectious diseases, decline in mortality, and that in turn, with all these changes, there would be a decline in fertility. And that's what was defined as the demographic transition. And then the epidemiological transition was emerging because of the changes in the age distribution, population aging, and there would be an emergence of chronic and non-communicable diseases. Whereas here, well, that's the typical, sort of the typical Ombrand also scenario. And then when we add here, and Mosley et al. Added here, talking about how if most of this occurred because of this, in particular, better medical technology and public health, then there could be still remaining greater inequality, greater socioeconomic inequality in the population, which yields a persistence or a reemergence of communicable diseases. And this is the part that we are going to focus on, the part where aging has occurred, but then there's still a persistence of communicable diseases. And this combination then gives rise to what they call a prolonged, because it's going to take a longer to complete the cycle to post-transition, and polarized because there's inequality, whereas the highly educated, higher income urban areas present the advanced transition diseases, whereas the lower educated rural would present the high infectious diseases patterns. Now, just to go back slightly, because I'm going to be talking about Mexico, it's exactly sort of what the transition diagram suggested. Mortality declines were experienced after 1940, and fertility declines started after 1970. Grossly, this is the scenario. And so the current elderly, those survive these high levels of infectious diseases. It's a very special cohort in the sense that they survive highly infectious disease regimes. The future elderly supposedly will be less exposed to infectious diseases, at least in childhood, and more to chronic conditions in older ages. But this mixture where they still have the infectious and chronic diseases means that probably the health improvements that we see at older ages in modern societies may be more difficult to achieve. And that, in a way, also implies a load of disability that it would be higher than in developed countries once again. And this is sort of the justification for our study of aging in Mexico, the fact that it's a different profile of aging, different than the ones we've seen in developed countries. This is a very special type of aging that we haven't seen before. And this is not only unique for Mexico, I shouldn't say, but right now it's common to a lot of the countries in Latin America, for example. This is where the momentum is right now. And so aging in this context of poor infrastructure, we're still having eroding support for the elderly in the form of Social Security, for example, family support in the sense of lower fertility, and historical inequality. It gives rise to, like I said, a different context for aging. Now, how fast is this aging to? It turns out to be much faster than previously also in developed countries. It takes, it's about, right now in 2010, about 9% of the population in Mexico is 60 and older. It was about 6% in the year 2000, projected to be 15 in 2027. That's about 27 years that it would take to move from 6 to 15. Now, similarly, for that movement, it took 40 years to Japan, who reached that level in 1985. Whereas the United States is going to take 70 years, reaching that level in 2013. So we are talking about accelerated aging simply because the drop in mortality and the drop in fertility was accelerated in Latin America or countries like Mexico. So when we talk about rapidly aging countries, this is what we mean. They're really accelerated. But at the same time, I don't want you to read the whole table, but I wanted to show you the main causes of morbidity in adults 65 and over reported by the Ministry of Health in Mexico. And you see the main 4 causes, say, for example, here, acute respiratory infections, intestinal infections, urinary tract infections are the main causes of disease or morbidity reported by the rate, this is per 100,000 population. And then in 2000 to 2010, there's very little change in the importance of these causes. So they're still at the top for population 65 and over. Hypertension, diabetes, pneumonias, cerebrovascular diseases are here, but they are not at the top of the morbidity causes. On the other hand, though, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, mental disorders, cancer, and respiratory illness account for about 66 and 2/3 of all the years lived with disability. So already it's the non-communicable diseases are manifested in this rapidly aging country. In Mexico, 84% of the deaths are due to these diseases and injuries, and all of those, 53% are among the elderly. So indeed, it's presenting the combination of non-communicable diseases that the transition would predict, but also it's still presenting the infectious regime that we were talking about. So this was all to motivate that. What I'd like to present now is that with that scenario, we were wondering if we can see it at the micro level. If, when we study the elderly in Mexico, we can see the combination of non-communicable diseases and infectious diseases in them, and how it manifests in either their health or their mortality. So because all along, so far, I'm talking about the macro level, what Omran talked about, what others have talked about in the transition. But do we see that, and how does it impact the well-being of the elderly? Like I was saying, those that are old right now. So how important is, we were wondering, how important are infectious diseases in the presence of non-communicable in older adults? Since we saw just evidence of how they are the main causes of death, but infections are still prevalent. And so the objective will be to establish how, in old age, infectious diseases contribute to the health and mortality of older adults, and how non-communicable diseases contribute, as well as the combination of both. And the idea is that the combination of both will accelerate their decline in health or their mortality. So we're going to examine the relationship between this type of disease, infectious or non-communicable, and self-reported health and or mortality. In the paper that I'm talking about is joint work with a couple of students and research fellows, and Alberto Palloni as well. Now, the importance of the question. I was just listening, I don't know if you probably do too. You listen to TED, those broadcasts, and I can't remember the name of the fellow. I had insomnia, so I went and listened to one of these things, and they usually put me to sleep pretty well. But one of them was saying that when you start and you want to sell something in marketing, what you should do first is to not talk about what, not say, I want to sell you this car, but say why you need this car. You start with that, why. And so that's why I did okay, why do we want to ask this question? And so if indeed infectious diseases show an influence on the mortality of the population level, what does it imply? Why do I want to know this? Why do I want you to know this? Well, if indeed this is true, the epidemiological transition in the literature of the epidemiological transition would mean that there's a stage in this transition. It's not just a transition between stages, but it may actually be a stage, right? And so we're trying to see if this is true or is holding for Mexico. Why the elderly? Because they're the ones in which we see non-communicable chronic diseases. And so we want to see if those, we see the manifestation. Compared to developed countries, if this is true, the impact of infections may be larger in these countries that are aging very fast. Because, again, the speed of aging was too fast for their socioeconomic development. It just moved too fast. And so it may result in different aging patterns. So we're saying it will imply different types of aging that we haven't seen. And this is one of the reasons. There are other reasons, obviously. And then, as I was saying, policymakers would need to remain attentive and then to diseases that are not just the non-communicable diseases. The literature moved too fast, we think, WHO, the World Bank. They moved too fast to the attention on the non-communicable diseases isolated from the infectious patterns. And we are going to argue that we need to consider them joint or jointly. Now, moving at the micro level, since we're going to move to individuals and whether they have or don't have the diseases, the idea is that the physiological reserve of the individuals decline with aging. And so because of this, then they become prone to being attacked or experience chronic non-communicable diseases and at the same time acute communicable diseases. And the body then is adapting chronically, that means all the time, right, to these attacks, to these diseases. It's a chronic adaptation and may actually weaken the ability to respond rapidly to an acute attack. And vice versa. When you have an acute communicable diseases or say frequently in a context in which there's infectious environment, and you receive an attack from these non-communicable diseases, the body is weaker to respond to this system. So the idea is that when you present both, there will be an increased risk for adverse events, and that's the reason why we want to know if this is holding. The data that I'm going to use at the micro level comes from the Mexican Health and Aging Study, and like I said, I'm going to talk more about it at the end. VM was a prospective panel study that we started representative of Mexicans born prior to 1951. So these are people that in 2001 were 50 and over. Right now, they are roughly 60 and over. The study is very similar to the health and retirement study, for those of you who are familiar with that. It's a study in person, in households in Mexico, and contains information of adults over age 50, like I said, representative of urban and rural areas in Mexico. The sample we're going to take are adults 50 and over that had a direct interview, that means not by proxy, and at baseline and at follow-up. And the sample is about 11,000 people. Very quickly, this is just going to be, I'm going to present results of a logit regression analysis for self-reported health with poor health. And if, when we look at follow-up, is or death, if the person has died. So the dependent variable would be self-reported health, poor versus non-poor. And the independent variables will be the main ones. The focus will be on what type of disease people report to have had. Communicable, non-communicable, both or neither. In the infectious category, we look at whether a person reports having a liver or kidney infection in the last year, in this case, tuberculosis and or pneumonia. And in non-communicable diseases, if the doctor has told them that they had at any time hypertension, diabetes, heart attack, lung disease, cancer, stroke, or arthritis. So any of these are in this category for this particular work. And we also control for age, gender, marital status, urban, rural, assets, wealth index, and education. We also control for self-reported health at baseline. Since we only have two waves to do the analysis, this is a simple logic, like I said, controlling for the self-reported health at baseline. So what do we find? Just basically the results, the descriptive results are more than 16% report poor health, self-report their health. This is the 5 scale. You report your health as excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. 16% reported as poor. 11% reported at least one infectious disease of the ones we mentioned. And 58% report at least one of the non-communicable diseases or chronic conditions. And the probability, when you do the analysis, of reporting poor health was higher in cross-section at baseline, was higher among those who report having a non-communicable disease compared to those with infectious diseases. But the poor self-reported health was significantly higher than those two, for individuals that report both. So the compound or the combined effect of both types of diseases seems to be pretty noticeable. Now, if we look now at baseline and follow-up, then we look at, like we said, in 2001, only 3% report infectious but not chronic diseases. About half reported chronic but not infectious. About 9% report both. and 38% report neither. So this is what happens in baseline. So when you add those up, that's what the 12.1 is this infectious plus that is 12, and then these two is 58. That's what they report. Okay, so it's not a lot, but it's pretty noticeable. And like I said, in particular, that the combination of both diseases seems to be noticeable. Now, what happens when we add to this cross-section that we had here? This is the previous slide in 2001. Now we add what happened in 2003, the same subjects in 2 years later. How do they report their health? And it's either non-poor or poor, but they could also be dead by 2003, 2 years later. And it's not enough dead to separate it as a third outcome right here, and that's why we needed to put it together with poor health. We didn't have enough people dead because it was, again, only 2 years later, and this is a whole group of 50 and over. In the whole sample, we have about 500 deaths. So what happens when, who reports poor health, depending on what they had in baseline? And the majority of people report poor or dead, about the same if they only report an infection or a chronic disease, slightly higher with chronic, but much higher if you report both. Again, the combination seems to be jointly determining a higher risk of poor health or death. And so pretty similar, the results after controlling for covariates, all the covariates I talked to you about. It turns out that indeed the risk of dying or having poor health in follow-up is 1.5 for infectious diseases, 1.8 for non-communicable, but 263 for both. And so what we were seeing in descriptives or in the cross-section seems to be holding also in longitudinal analysis. So what we find then, if we plot it then, the predicted probability of transitioning in self-reported health or death by the type of disease at baseline. And these are just the patterns of how the self-reported health evolves or transitions in time between the two waves. And the probability of remaining in poor health is, or dying actually in this case, is highest for those both, as we were seeing, and then chronic, and then infectious, and neither. And this is just with age, so how the probability is increasing with age. The probability of worsening is similar, it's a different slope. The probability of improvement is the best for those who have neither, but the worst for those who have both kinds of diseases. And the probability of remaining healthy is basically the same pattern as improving, except in a little higher and different slope. But what we see then is what with age, the patterns also seem to be what we expected or what we see in the descriptive results. Now, I'm going to show you very quickly evidence on mortality risks. And that we separate with another postdoctoral fellow from the National Institute of Geriatrics in Mexico, Cesar Gonzalez, and the same collaborators from Texas. We worked on this paper, but said, let's take out just mortality risks. Let's see how much we can do with the 500 deaths that we had. But Cesar Gonzalez and co-authors wanted to focus on the timing of the chronic and infectious report, whether they have it in wave 1 and or in wave 2, whereas the previous analysis, I was only looking at baseline and what happened at follow-up. And so very similar, the results that we get looking at major chronic conditions and certain infections, very similar infections. We estimated the probability of death by 2003 according to the combinations of diseases. And this is the plot of those probabilities of deaths. And I want to say with cautious because of the number of cases in particular, so we're stretching the data. But this shows what is the probability of death for people healthy that report neither one of the two types of diseases. And that's the odds of mortality. And CLDHS is if you had cancer, lung disease, heart disease, or stroke. If you had one of those with an infectious disease in baseline, but no infectious disease in 2003, it would be this green line. If you had it, again, a combination of those chronic diseases and no infections in 2001 or 3, then you would be a little below that one, but close to that one. And then these two are those who had that type of chronic diseases with infections in both 2001 and 2003. That's the highest one. And the other one, the purple one, is when you had an infection, not in 2001, but yes, in 2003. So depending on the report, then you end up having different risk of mortality. And by this, I should add that how can we study mortality and who's reporting the infectious disease if the person is dead, right? So this is what we do in the longitudinal studies on aging, right? We follow the person until death, and then we interview the next of kin. So the next of kin is telling us what diseases that person had since the last way we visited them until the time of death. And so that's when I talk to you about reporting an infectious disease, but no infectious disease in the baseline, but yes, in the follow-up. That's what I mean. The next of kin is telling us. So this is one of the limitations of the study, actually. Okay. In related work, and I'm not going to show you any graphs, just to tell you that we also took a look at ADL disability, ADL, the activities of daily living, and see how they are associated with, again, the types of diseases that people are reporting. Now they are all living. And so we start with older adults without disability at baseline, and then we look at the effect of infections and non-communicable diseases combined on disability onset and the transition to death. And so they start without any, and it turns out that infectious diseases provides a higher risk of higher mortality at follow-up, whereas non-communicable diseases have a greater impact on the onset of disability at follow-up. So this is a very interesting way of looking at what happens what's the onset, what is more important for the onset, and then for the progression of disability and death. And so again, we find an effect of both infectious and non-communicable diseases and the combination. So in these three types of analysis in which we look at self-reported health, we look at mortality, and we look at the onset and progression of disability, we'd like to conclude about the epidemiological transition in Mexico and how it's affecting older adults. So we see that the epidemiological transition has advanced in Mexico. We saw it with the causes of non-communicable diseases in the cross-section and in our panel. People seem to be mostly suffering from non-communicable diseases, but infectious diseases are still highly prevalent. This mixed regime seems to affect the overall quality, we said, with disability, with self-reported health. And I wrote and mortality in parentheses because I'm very much aware of the sample size limitation. Among older adults, that's what we could study, and that's what results seem to reflect that. And so this seems to indicate more to us as a stage, like I was saying at the beginning, not so much just a transition timing in which we're going to move between one stage and the other, but it looks to us more like a stage in which we may stay for a while. For a while because the socioeconomic conditions that brought about the aging of this population were not the socioeconomic conditions, but rather the fast medical technology that was adopted both for mortality and fertility. And so because of this, while these socioeconomic conditions will not change, while inequality will continue to exist, there will continue to be an infectious regime. And so this may be a longer stage than we thought. And because of that, then these new aging processes will come to be, because like I said, we haven't seen them. We haven't seen them in this context. And so we need to study aging them from a different perspective in this particularly rapid aging countries. And so we shouldn't be neglecting then, as I said, that's kind of the call from the beginning, in particular in these countries in which aging is occurring too fast and we should be talking about joint interventions for chronic and infectious diseases as opposed to dividing the limited resources, taking them now to chronic diseases and leaving infectious, or fighting for the resources to look at one type of disease or the other. In particular, because we are seeing, well, in other research, researchers are finding the interaction between, say, tuberculosis and diabetes, for example, and vice versa. So they both seem to be coming together, one causing the other causing the one. We don't know what, in this particular type of study, we can't know which came first. We just couldn't ask that. And so what are the limitations we had? And then that indicates our future for this research is that the evidence was based on self-reports of diseases. They're telling us that they had infections. They're telling us that the doctor has told them that they had these chronic diseases. But we're not looking at clinical records or anything that indicates to us for a large national sample that these are indeed happening. The interaction, like I was saying, between diseases was not observed. We don't know what happened first. They reported that they had a chronic disease, and then they report they had an infection. But we don't know if the infection came about because of the chronic condition or because they were exposed to something in the environment. So that, I think we need to take a closer look to that interaction. Longitudinal studies on aging, like the HRS, like the MHAS, I'm going to talk about it. There's a large family of studies right now like them. And they usually focus on non-communicable diseases. We are all talking about cancer, stroke, heart disease, lung disease, right? We are not. We're talking hypertension, diabetes, but we're not talking about infections. And I think that when we move to study aging in these countries, we should be focusing more on that in the interaction. And also, as I said, the limited number of mortality cases we had to study in the MHAS, it was only a 2-year follow-up, so we couldn't follow it too close. Okay, so all of these, I hope to try to tell you that we are hoping to have more cases of mortality in the future on these kinds of studies. And so I'm going to tell you now what the future of the Mexican Health and Aging study is. We are moving to do a third wave of the study. And now I'm going to talk about then the MHAS in a few minutes. There's 2 generations of the MHAS. MHAS 1 was done in 2001 and 2003, and that's the one we used for the analysis, all of the analysis that I presented to you. It was a national representative panel on aging in Mexico, individuals age 50 plus. We followed them. We had a baseline interview and then a follow-up 2 years later. Like I said, it's very similar to the health and retirement study, focused on self-report of conditions, cognition, functional status with ADL, IADL, symptoms, because many times people don't know that because they haven't seen a doctor that they have conditions, but they can report the symptoms they have. Depression, healthcare use, expenditures in healthcare, migration history, transfers, work and work history, housing conditions, pensions plans for the future, income, and assets. 2 waves were funded by the NIA, and we conducted that study, as I said, in 2001 and 2003. We identified households with at least 1 person, age 50 plus. And the MHAS work was conducted in 2001 and re-interviewed in 2003. Those are the sample sizes, a national sample with representation of urban-rural. And like I said, in 2003, if you arrive and the person is dead, then a next of kin answers a questionnaire. It's about an average 80-minute interview. And actually, Monica Espinosa is here in the audience, and she used to work in the MHAS when I was back in Maryland and she was in Penn. And so we worked on the phone every day, pretty much. Skype didn't exist yet. So we were on the phone every day, and she worked on the second wave, the MHAS. So it was great. So we had an oversample in migration states. Six states in Mexico account for about 40% of the migrants to the U.S., according to statistics about the end of the 20th century. So we had an oversample on these 6 states because there's a large emphasis on the consequences, long-term consequences of migration to the U.S. in the study. So we had this oversample of almost 2 to 1. The study also contemplates childhood health and socioeconomic conditions in childhood, thinking of the Barker type of hypothesis that talk about the effect of childhood health and how it might impact old age health and disability. We have details on employment history, like I said. Migration history is very interesting for internal migration as well to the U.S. One interesting statistic that we see from this, our sample of analysis, our population is population 50 and over who lives in Mexico. Right? So what we see is either somebody who has children in the U.S. or has come back from being a migrant in the U.S., but they're back in Mexico. That's our sample. And so it lends itself to put it together with studies that look at other countries, or the U.S. in this case, and the other who are from Mexico and are in the U.S., because what we capture here are the ones in Mexico. Okay? But what we know from these, the ones are in Mexico, back in Mexico, is that 14% of men, for example, who are 50 and older in Mexico are former migrants from the U.S. 14% of men, much fewer women. But 20% of men and women who are in Mexico, age 50 and over, have at least one child, at least one, who's in the U.S. right now. So the interaction between the two countries for aging reasons, for aging research, is very, very important. And probably that's why NIA is funding this study. But one of the reasons why we, like I said, we, like a salesperson, you'd have to tell NIA why to fund this study. And this is one of the reasons. There's a lot of interaction between the two countries, and aging of the two countries was very important. We also have household residents and the composition of the household. The transfers and help received and given from and to children is a very important aspect of aging in poor countries where there's no social security, universal social security, and healthcare. And so the remittances from children is a very important support for the elderly. As I said, healthcare use, expenditures, and then we move to subjective measures such as locus of control, perceived family support, decision-making power, and all the psychosocial aspects of aging. And this is just to show you the high response rates that we got in the baseline 90%, in the follow-up 93%. And so it was a very, we had very high participation of people in Mexico. And of course, all the credit goes to the fieldwork agency, INEGI is our partner, as I'm going to tell you in a minute. So we proposed then to do waves 3 and 4 again. Now we're going to collect that data in 2012 and 2014. So if you remember that the other one was 2001 and 3. So this is 9 years later. We're going back to look at people, for people in 2012. So we're going to re-interview survivors of 2003 and interview relatives of the deceased. And we expect about 2,600 people dead. In addition to the other 500 that we already had, we're going to have about 3,000 deaths. We're going to add sample to yield, again, representative sample of population 50 and over at the third wave. Because as I said, people were 50 and over in 2001. About now, they're moved to be 60 and over. So we have a gap there on 50 to 59 ages. So we're going to add a new sample to those ages. Refresh the sample. In a subsample, which we didn't do in the previous waves, we are going to have biomarkers and performance measures to a subsample. And the survey is going to be moved from paper and pencil to copy, the computer-assisted personal interview system. So this was a major undertaking on moving and adding these new components and moving the survey to copy. And the subsample is about 2,200 observations that we expect to come back with for anthropometric measures, biomarkers, and performance measurements. The biomarkers that we decided to get was CRP, protein, total cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, thyroid hormones in to measure with whole blood, and vitamin D. This is all with whole blood. And then with a finger prick, which is dry blood spot that you analyze right away, you prick them, and then with a little needle, you collect one dot, and then you put that in an apparatus, and that's the HemoQ, and that you can measure hemoglobin right away. And also you can measure the circulating amount of glucose in the last 3 months right away with the second drop of blood. And so we're going to do those two things. We did the finger prick, and then we're going to do intravenous blood, and this is analyzed in the lab. And then we're going to save some blood. And we're going to have measurements tests, measures walking speed, grip strength, and balance with the feet. And like I said, we're going to move to more psychosocial content. That seems to be where aging studies have moved in the last 10 years, these areas, and that's why, in a way, we moved to. Again, we're going to have the biomarkers only. The subsample belongs only to 4 of the 32 states because we wanted to send all the lab to one central lab with the National Institute of Public Health in Cuernavaca. So these 4 states are the ones that are receiving the blood tests. Now, this just tells you the sample size. When we started in 2001, we were 15,000 people, and we did a subsample of 2,500 anthropometric measures. We revisited in 2003, and we found 14,000 of those. We had 546 deaths. Then we go back in 2012, add new sample of about 6,200 people. And so we attempt, we had this plus these, we're going to attempt 20,500 people. We expect to have 2,600 deaths. And so in wave 4 in 2014, we expect to revisit the ones that are surviving, these minus the deaths and so on. And we revisit 15,000 people by 2014. And cumulative, we would have 3,800 deaths by then. The fieldwork started, the wave 3 fieldwork started in October 1st, 2012, and we have moved. Again, we're going to have another sample of migration states, slightly different states, but it's a same oversample of 1.7 to 1. And how do we do this fieldwork? How do we recontact or try to find 15,000 or 14,000 people that we had in 2003, tried to get them in 2012. So the fieldwork agency, INEGI in Mexico, decided to do a preliminary contact first, sweep the sample that we were going to follow up, not the new sample, but just the follow-up sample, sweep it and see if they're where they used to be, and if not, where are they? And so they did that in August 2012. So they found the addresses of the new ones that moved, or the way to contact them. They also found out who had died and whether the next of kin was going to be in the address where they went, and if not, what address. So they had it all set to then launch the fieldwork October 1. So they updated the directory of the follow-up sample and identified, like I said, all these changes. If people split, we follow them. Right, so if we have to get the address of the spouse that moved, or if they both moved. And so, as I said, we're currently in the field and collecting this data. And this is all done, like I said, from INEGI. What we have is a supervisor, special supervisor at each of the states, 32 plus one state that has 2, so 33. And we have a process supervisor. This is a computing guru that deals with any problems with the CAPI system or the computers, and uploading the interviews at night and downloading new systems if there is, and so on. We have one of these in each of the regional offices. And then 44 supervisors, and then 189 interviewers. And this is the people in the field, and then people in the central office in INEGI. So that's why we can do this in 8 weeks of field work in Mexico. By October 30, 2012, INEGI reports that we have contacted about 2/3 of the sample, and 80% provided a direct interview, 5% a proxy interview. This is when the person is not cognitively able to provide the interview, or if it's going to be an extended absence and they will not be home before the field work gets out of the area, then it's about 5%. And the next of kin, basically people who had died, we got 15% of responses of the interviews, of these interviews. And so this adds to 100% of these 63%. The response rate is about 80.4%, so we're missing either refusals or loss to follow up about 20%. So we are not done. We hope to be done by next week or so. And these are images of just our field work. I was visiting, I'm right there in Oaxaca. I was telling Noreen, it was very exciting to go back to the field. And this is the interviewer I was with that day, and he was interviewing the lady, and I was interviewing the husband. Is there another interviewer? And this guy wanted to give the interview right here, standing by a tree, but she was given a little something to sit down on. And then this is the anthropometrics. I actually observed in Oaxaca people being measured, and this is the balance test, and they actually agreed to give blood. So I was telling also people last night that it's pretty amazing that these are, of course, by the time the blood, the way the field work is being done this time is that the INEGI sends the interviewers for the 80-minute interview, and then a week later or 2 weeks later, depending on where you are, the National Institute of Public Health sends the nurses to get the blood and the measurements and so on. But the people that, when the nurse arrives, these are already people who agreed to give you an interview. They already gave the interview. And so they're very selected in the way. So we're getting 95% response rate on the blood. So it's a very high participation so far. Let's see, as usual, the most difficult cases are left till the end, and so I expect that response rate is going to drop. You try and you try until the end, and then you close the case. But you keep trying, so that's why we look so good so far. Now, I just wanted to mention the family of studies like this one, because what I just talked to you about studying aging in rapidly aging countries is now enabled because now we are a family of studies of aging. For those of you who want to study this aspect. We started with the health and retirement study that we said. It started in 1992, and they study the sample every 2 years. They revisit their sample, and they refresh every 6 years, as you may know. Okay, so that's kind of like the grandfather of them all, right? They started first. We followed in 2001, and when we did it, with the only 2 studies that were out there. Then after that, we had other studies that are not appearing. Oh, there you go. Costa Rica did a study, and they have 2 waves in their study. Preco in Puerto Rico, which is not another country, but sort of another country. It also has 2 waves, that study. And then SHARE in Europe came to be. There are now 20 countries doing this type of study, like the HRS or the MHAS. At the same time, sort of at the same time, England came up with the ELSA, which doesn't, oh, okay, they all came together. ELSA came first in TILDA in Ireland, and SHARE now, like I said, has been adding countries little by little, so now there are 20. Very recently, Thailand. Thailand is HEART, LASI is India, CHARLES is China, CLOSA is Korea, JSTAR is Japan, and IFLS is Indonesia, which is not quite an aging study, but it's become an aging study because they added all sample to their study. So what it is that now enables comparison that I was talking about, when we now can speak of rapidly aging, moderately aging, fast aging, infectious diseases, poor countries, rich countries. Whereas before, it used to be mostly developed countries in the group. So we're very excited, working very closely with China and India in particular, because we are comparing infectious diseases, batteries, and approaches. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't leave much time for questions, but this is it. Thank you.